Bizarre medieval knight rules you had to follow or die. Listen. You think you know knights? Shining armor, chivalry, rescuing maidens, Arthur and his round table. Forget all of it. That's poetry written centuries later by men who never held a sword. The real medieval knight lived inside a cage of rules so strange, so absolute, and so lethally enforced that one wrong glance at the wrong moment could end with a rope around your neck, a sword through your belly, or your coat of arms being dragged through the mud and officially erased from existence. I'm not exaggerating. I'm going to walk you through the bizarre, often incomprehensible code that a knight had to follow just to stay alive, from the moment he woke before dawn to the moment he closed his eyes at night. And even then the rules followed him into his dreams. And with every rule, I'll show you how breaking it wasn't just a mistake. It was a death sentence, sometimes a very creative one. Start at the beginning. Before you could even be a knight, you had to survive the pages and squires training, and that was a net of lethal customs. A boy sent to a lord's castle to serve was legally a nonentity, a body that belonged to the household. If he dropped the lord's war helmet and it struck the ground, the metal sound was an insult to the armor spirit, and that squire could be beaten so severely that death was common. Not a judicial punishment, just a fact. A heavy gauntlet fist to the temple, and the boy was gone. No inquiry. The rule of the armor demanded reverence. You placed a gauntlet palm up, never palm down, because palm down mimicked a dead man's hand. A squire who carelessly tossed a gauntlet onto a table palm down in a Burgundian court in 1387 was seized by knights who interpreted it as a death omen against their lord. They held him down and broke his wrist with a mace, then left him in the yard to bleed out. The written justification? He had insulted the iron that protected the bloodline. That was the rule. Once you were knighted, the ceremony itself bristled with kill or be killed symbolism. The ritual bath was not about cleanliness. The water was infused with herbs like vervain and betterny, and the knight-to-be had to submerge himself in absolute silence. If he gasped, coughed, or spoke a single word before the presiding bishop or eldest knight recited the blessing, the bath was considered profaned. I've read an account from the 1330s of a young Bavarian noble who murmured a prayer too soon. He whispered, "Christ receive me," before the priest uttered the benediction. The knights around the tub interpreted this as a claim of false sanctity, a kind of spiritual usurpation. They pulled him out, wrapped him in a shroud still wet, and locked him in a chapel overnight with an armed guard. By morning, they decided his voice had released a demon into the water. He was given a blunt sword and told to fight the demon in single combat, against a fully armored veteran. He died. The rule was that the bath of knighthood was a womb of silence. To break silence was to murder your own honor before you were born, and the penalty was death by arms, but with the exquisite cruelty of giving the doomed man a useless blade so his death looked like an accident of divine judgment. Now the dubbing itself. The ceremonial blow to the shoulder or neck, the kali, was meant to be the last hit a knight ever received unanswered. If the knight doing the dubbing struck you and you flinched, stumbled, or shifted your foot, you had shown fear. That was a fatal flaw. In a French ordination in 1415, on the eve of Agincourt, a newly dubbed knight moved his head a fraction when the constable's flat sword tapped his neck. A drop of blood appeared because the blade had accidentally nicked him. The assembled men-at-arms ceased breathing. The constable stepped back and said, "The sword has tasted the blood of a frightened man." The young man was stripped of his golden spurs there and then, his belt cut with a knife, and he was led out of the camp. The next day, before the battle, he was placed in the front rank with no helmet and a spear that had its head removed, and the English archers did the rest. The rule was unspoken but absolute. The kali was a test of the nerves, and the body's betrayal was punishable by denial of burial in consecrated ground, which to them was worse than death, but death was how they got there. Then there's the sheer, demented mountain of rules around the sword. The weapon wasn't just a tool, it was a theological statement. The crossguard formed the Holy Cross. A knight who grasped his sword by the blade during Mass, or allowed the point to touch the ground in a church, had committed blasphemy. I'm going to tell you about a rule that sounds like a fever dream but is documented in multiple ordinances of the Teutonic Order. If a knight let his sword fall from his hand inside the chapter house, the sword was considered to have chosen a new master. The knight who dropped it had to kneel and beg the sword's forgiveness, literally addressing it, "Iron, forgive my weak flesh." If a superior refused to return it, that knight became swordless. And a swordless knight was legally dead. He was made to lie face down before the altar while the funeral mass for the dead was sung over him. He could hear the words "requiescat in pace" spoken as if he were a corpse. If, after a full day and night, no senior knight argued for his resurrection, he was dragged to the gate, given a piece of bread and a staff, and expelled into the forest. Civil law didn't protect him. Any peasant could kill him for his boots. The rule was that a knight without a sword had no soul that the order recognized, and a soulless creature could be exterminated. That's not a metaphor. That's a military monastic regulation from the year 1290. Even drawing your sword had a syntax of life and death. You could not draw your sword in the presence of the king unless commanded or unless you were performing the specific office of the sovereign's protector. In 1283, at a feast in Wales, a marcher lord half drew his blade to cut a piece of meat that was too tough for his eating knife. The sound of the blade scraping free of the scabbard caused the king's household knights to surround him with drawn swords. The king, Edward I, gave a signal. They didn't kill the lord, but they didn't let him go either. They held him down on the table, and using his own partly drawn sword, they sliced off the thumb and first two fingers of his right hand, the hand that had dared to draw steel in the royal presence. He survived, but without those fingers he could never grip a sword again, which meant his knighthood was extinguished, and he died 3 years later of a fever that everyone attributed to the shame rotting his blood. The law said that unsanctioned drawn steel within the verge of the king's presence was petty treason, and petty treason was death, but they made a spectacle of a living death instead. You had to know exactly when the air around you allowed you to touch your hilt. Now think about the rules of the table, because a banquet was a minefield. Knights ate in a strict hierarchy, and the carving of meat was a ritualized language. If you cut a boar's head before the highest-ranking knight had received the first slice from the carver's hands, you had usurped precedence, an insult to the entire lineage of that high lord. An Alsatian chronicle describes a dinner in 1354 where a young knight, desperately hungry after a long patrol, speared a piece of venison with his own dagger before the count had been served. The count's steward knocked the dagger away, and the count declared the young man's appetite a sign of bestial nature unfit for the table of honor. The sentence? The knight was stripped to his shirt and tied to the pig trough outside. The cooks poured hot pottage over his hands and face, not enough to kill outright, but the burns festered and he died wailing 10 days later. The rule codified later stated that any knight who served his own belly before his lords was declaring his stomach a god, and blasphemers of the order of the table were to be fed like beasts until they died. You had to sit, wait, and watch the precise angle of the steward's knife as if your soul depended on it. Because it did. And then there was the impossible business of fasting and feasting. The liturgical calendar determined what you could swallow. On Fridays and Saturdays, all flesh was forbidden. A knight on crusade in the 1240s, starving and sick, shot a bird that was not a mammal, so he thought it a permissible fish-like thing because it flew. He roasted and ate it on a Friday. The camp's chaplain saw the feathers and declared the knight an unrepentant sinner who had consumed flesh on a fast day while bearing the cross. The penalty in the Crusader codes for breaking fast was death by stoning within the army, because such sin invited God's wrath on the whole host. The man pleaded that the bird was of the air. The chaplain retorted that all flesh of the air and earth was Adam's flesh, and only water creatures were spared. A circle of knights, his own brothers, threw stones until he stopped moving. The rule was that a knight's stomach belonged to the church first, his body second, and a rumbling gut that disobeyed the fast was a rebel to be executed. Let's go deeper into the clothing because every thread was a code. A knight could not wear certain colors on certain days without risking his neck. Purple was a sovereign color. In the Holy Roman Empire during the 12th century, any knight who wore a purple cloak or even a purple silk lining visible at the collar within the imperial court was deemed to be usurping the majesty of the emperor. That was lèse-majesté, high treason. The punishment was beheading, but the sword had to cut through the offending purple cloth as well. The executioner would wrap the condemned's neck in his own purple collar and slice through both, symbolically killing the usurpation. There's a record of an Italian knight in the retinue of Frederick Barbarossa who had his wife sew a beautiful purple embroidered tunic. He wore it to a tournament, not even in the emperor's immediate view. A jealous rival informed the court. The knight was arrested in his tent, the tunic ripped off him, and he was executed the next morning on a charge of wearing majesty. His body was buried without the tunic, which was burned as a treasonous object. The rule was that colors were property, and a knight's blood paid for color trespass. Spurs were even more lethal. Golden spurs were the very symbol of knighthood. If a knight was to be degraded, his spurs were hacked off with a cleaver. But there were rules about when spurs could even jingle. A knight who entered a church with his spurs on was committing an act of prideful noise in the house of silence. In some orders, he would be forced to remove the spurs and give them to the church as penance. If he refused, he was considered a rebel against God's peace. In 1312, a Hospitaller knight in Cyprus walked into the Cathedral of Nicosia wearing spurs after a skirmish, still bloody, too exhausted to remove them. The bishop ordered the knights of the guard to unhook the spurs from his heels by force. The knight, in fever and fury, drew a knife. That act of drawing a blade in a consecrated space converted the infraction into sacrilege. The penalty for sacrilege under the Hospitaller rule was the Cell of Oblivion, which was a pit dug into the rock beneath the castle. The knight was lowered into it, given no light, no human voice, a piece of bread daily, until death. The rule was, sacred space unmakes the spurs, and the man who won't unmake his spurs unmakes himself forever. Hair and beard were monitored for heresy. The long hair of a knight wasn't just fashion, it was a sign of his free status. But if a knight clipped his hair too short or shaved in the manner of a monk without having taken monastic vows, the ecclesiastical courts could judge him for usurping the holy state. In a bizarre case from Lincoln in 1275, a knight shaved his head entirely as a penance for killing a priest in a brawl, but he did so without episcopal permission. The bishop held that the knight had performed an unlicensed tonsure, and had thus mockingly taken the outward sign of a cleric while living by the sword. The judgment was that since he had chosen the appearance of a man of peace, he must live as one. His right hand, the hand of violence, was branded and he was forbidden to ever bear arms again. He had to walk barefoot to every church in the diocese. Without the protection of his knightly weapons, his enemies caught up with him and slit his throat in a ditch. The rule was that the body's appearance was a legal document, and altering it falsely was a self-imposed death warrant. Now the daily business of words. Knights lived under a tyranny of language. The word coward, spoken openly in the presence of peers, had to be answered with blood within the hour, or the accused accepted the label forever, which led to loss of status, which in a frontier zone meant anyone could kill you without war guilt. If two knights were in a garrison and one called the other a liar, and the insulted knight did not immediately throw his gauntlet, the garrison commander could rule that the insult had become truth through silence. That Truthful coward or liar could be hanged from the battlements as a man of no honor, because honor was the only currency, and a knight without currency was counterfeit and had to be destroyed. In the Catalan Company's chronicle, a knight called another goat-faced son of a scabbed whore. The insulted man laughed, thinking it too absurd. The commander, a ruthless veteran, declared that laughter at a personal insult proved the truth of the insult, because a true knight would feel the wound. Both men were forced to fight without armor to the death the next morning. The one who laughed was killed, and the insulter was severely wounded, then finished off by the commander because he had spawned discord. 2 dead for 1 mouthful of syllables. The rule was that a knight's ear was a gate of honor, and any word that touched the gate required blood to clean it. Even your dreams could kill you. There was a widespread belief that a knight's nocturnal emissions, what they called night pollution, were a sign of demonic visitation that rendered the knight ritually unclean and unfit for combat. If a knight confessed to having such a dream on the eve of battle and still went to fight, and the army lost, that knight could be blamed for bringing divine disfavor. After the disastrous Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, French knights were accused of every imaginable sin. One young Burgundian admitted under interrogation by his own commanders that he had dreamed of a naked succubus the night before the battle and had not confessed it. He was condemned not by the Turks but by a makeshift court of his peers. They tied him to a post and used his own sword to disembowel him, pulling out his entrails as an offering to restore the army's purity, then burned his body. The rule was that the sleeping mind of a knight was a battlefield between angels and demons, and a dream-defeated knight had lost his internal war. The external punishment was simply the cleanup. Then there is the hidden rule of the weapons themselves. A knight could not strike a horse of a higher-ranking lord, even in a tournament, without immense risk. Horses were ranked. A destrier with a coat of arms embroidered on its caparison was almost an extension of the lord's body. In a tournament in 1241 at Neuss, a knight's lance splintered and a sharp shard flew into the eye of the opposing team's horse, a horse belonging to the Count of Jülich. The horse fell and broke its neck. Even though it was an accident, the knight who threw the lance had to undergo the judgment of the bridle. He was forced to kneel, the dead horse's bit was placed in his mouth like a bridle, and the count's marshal led him around the lists on all fours while grooms whipped his back. Once the ritual humiliation ended, the count pronounced that the debt could only be settled by the man taking the horse's place in death. The knight was given a horse's skin to wear as a cloak and a wooden sword, and he was tied to a stake in the horse's grave pit while archers shot him. The rule was that a noble animal's death demanded a human soul of equal standing, and rank decided the exchange rate. Listen to the rules about touching a woman of noble blood without permission. This is a labyrinth of death. A knight who caught a lady's glove that she dropped and kept it without immediately kneeling and offering it back could be accused of glove theft for love magic, a dark superstition that he would use the intimate object to force her affections through sorcery. Sorcery among knightly classes was punishable by burning, even for men. In 1320, a knight in the court of the Count of Hainaut picked up a lady's fallen girdle and, as a jest, tucked it into his sleeve. The lady screamed that he was binding her womb in witchcraft. Within hours, the Count ordered the knight seized. A search of his belongings turned up some dried herbs his squire used for stomach ailments, but they were declared proof of maleficium. He was burned at the stake in the castle courtyard, and his name scratched from the roll of knights. The rule was that a knight's hands were potential conductors of diabolical power, and any unorthodox contact with a woman's garment was a pact with the devil, which burned. Now let's explore the bizarre rules of the challenge gauntlet. The gauntlet was not just a glove, it was a formalized war declaration token. You had to throw it on the ground in a specific way. If the gauntlet landed with fingers spread, it meant, I accuse you of a crime of the whole hand, like treason. If fingers together, a personal insult. If it landed palm up, it was a request for judicial duel. If a knight threw his gauntlet and it landed wrong, say, it spun and ended up with the thumb tucked under, the entire challenge could be void, and worse, the challenger could be taken as a false accuser. Under the customs of the court of chivalry in England, a false accuser in a capital case was to suffer the same punishment the accused would have suffered. In 1386, a knight named Sir John Annesley threw a gauntlet accusing another of betraying a fortress. The gauntlet, a heavy steel-backed thing, clattered and rested awkwardly, half-folded. The constable ruled that the voice of the gauntlet was garbled. Annesley was arrested, tried for false accusation, and condemned to death. He was drawn behind a horse to the gallows, hanged briefly, cut down while still alive, and beheaded. That was the mercy version. The rule was that the gauntlet spoke for its master, and an inarticulate gauntlet meant a lying tongue, and lying tongues were cut out before the final chop. And then there was the nightmare of heraldic law. A knight's coat of arms was his identity and his property, protected by the heralds with execution powers. If two knights showed up to a tournament bearing the same arms, the heralds would hold an instant tribunal. The one who could not prove senior right was disarmed and his shield turned upside down. If he refused to yield the arms, it was arms usurpation, treated as an act of war against the rightful owner's lineage. The usurper was not just killed, his body was denied heraldic funeral. In 1347, during the siege of Calais, two knights from different retinues discovered they bore the same red chevron on gold. One was a Frenchman, the other a Hainaut in English service. The English king, Edward III, ordered a trial by battle on the spot. They fought in a ditch. The Frenchman killed. The Hainaut. Then, by the heraldic law, Edward's own heralds declared that the dead knight's body, because it had borne usurped arms, must be dishonored. They stripped it, painted the false arms on his naked chest with his own blood, and left him to the crows. The rule was that your painted shield was your second soul, and a soul thief forfeited his first soul's resting place. The laws of the siege were another universe of death. A knight who was part of a garrison that surrendered unconditionally could not, by the rules of many military orders, ever bear arms again unless ransomed and specifically reinvested. The Teutonic Knights had a rule that any brother knight who surrendered a fortress without first losing 60% of the defenders was guilty of cowardice and betrayal of the order's virgin patron. He was brought before the chapter in his white mantle. The mantle was ripped from him piece by piece. Then he was given a black cloak of shame. The rule then demanded a wall of silence around him. For 1 year he had to serve the other knights as a mute servant. If he spoke one word, the sentence defaulted to death by walling up. There is an account of a knight named Heinrich von Plotzkau who, after surrendering a waterlogged fort in Samagisha, was degraded. In the 9th month of his silence, he groaned aloud in his sleep, and the brother who slept in the next cot reported him. The master of the order interpreted the involuntary groan as a breach of the wall of silence. Heinrich was taken to the chapel crypt, and a small masonry cell was built around him with just an air hole. They passed him the Eucharist once, then mortared the hole shut. The rule was that the voice of a coward was a poison that must be sealed in stone. Let's consider the meals again, but this time the act of drinking. A knight could not drink to another knight's lady's health without explicit permission from the lord or husband. To do so was a public statement that you were the lady's champion, a direct challenge. At a feast in Bordeaux in 1412, a Gascon knight raised his cup and said, "To the unrivaled beauty of the Lady of L'Espar," whose husband was seated 3 seats down and had not authorized the toast. The husband rose, dashed the cup from the knight's hand, and declared that the wine had become poison of adultery. The offending knight, bound by the rules of the table, could not deny the implication without impugning the lady's honor, so he had to accept the accusation or fight. He fought. He lost, his skull split by the husband's axe. The lady, by the way, was sent to a convent the next day because her name had been spoken unchaperoned. The rule was that a woman's name in a knight's mouth was either a prayer or a weapon, and an unauthorized weapon in the hall meant death in the yard. Now, the rules of silence in the forest. The hunting laws were draconian, but knights were the enforcers and often the victims. A knight had to know the exact number of horn calls to blow when killing different beasts. The death of a stag required a specific mort call, a long note that died in a certain way. If a knight blew the mort incorrectly, the master of the hunt could claim the knight had stolen the kill from the king or the lord of the forest, because the horn was the voice of the hunt's truth. In the forest law of the Norman kings, a knight who blew a false mort was a poacher regardless of the actual kill. Poaching a royal deer was punishable by blinding and castration, but for a knight the punishment was often commuted to beheading because mutilation was considered more shameful to the order. A record from the forest heir of 1277 tells of a knight, Sir Ralph de Beoces, who shot a stag and, in excitement, blew a series of short, non-standard hoots. The verderers seized him. The court found that his horn had lied. He was beheaded with a woodsman's axe on the very spot where the stag fell, his body left as a warning. The rule was, the horn that lies is the tongue that lies, and a knight's tongue in the forest belonged to the king. Another forgotten rule, the death grip on the sword. A knight was forbidden to die with an empty hand. If a knight was mortally wounded in battle, his companions were required to close his fingers around his sword hilt before his soul departed. If they failed, and the knight died with his palm open and empty, it was believed his ghost would wander as a damned spirit, and the knights who failed in their duty were held accountable for the fate of the soul. At the Battle of Crécy, there was a chaotic retreat. A dying English knight, Sir Thomas de Holland, an ancestor, was found with his hands slack. The men who found him were so afraid of the spiritual repercussions that they severed his sword hand at the wrist and buried it separately clasped around the sword hilt in the church at Calais, while his body went to a family crypt. The bizarre rule inspired a corollary. Any knight who allowed his commander's hand to die empty could be charged with spiritual murder. That charge, heard before an ecclesiastical court, could carry excommunication, and an excommunicated knight was a living corpse who could be lawfully killed by anyone. So, failing to place the sword in the dying hand could lead to your own death, physical and spiritual. The bath rule extended even to full-fledged knights. A knight returning from campaign had to go through a purification bath before he could sit at the table or touch his wife. The bath was a ritual cleansing of the blood touch and the death shadow. If a knight walked directly into the hall still bearing the dust of the road and the invisible stain of killing, he was bringing murder breath into the household. A strong custom in 13th century French households mandated that a squire block the hall door with a drawn sword until the lord bathed. If the knight pushed past, the squire had a terrifying duty. He had to strike, aiming to wound the thigh to prevent entry. If the squire failed to stop the knight, the squire was hanged for letting the pollution in. If the knight killed the squire to force entry, the knight himself would be arrested by the other household knights and put on trial for inviting a curse onto the hearth. The penalty was exile and disinheritance, but often they'd simply hold his head under the bath water until the bubbles stopped, because in their minds a man who refused water was a man possessed by fire demons who feared drowning, and a possessed knight was too dangerous to live. The order of sleeping in a shared tent or hall carried lethal protocol. A knight could not turn his back to another knight of higher station while disrobing. To expose the spine was a symbolic abdication of defense, a declaration of inferiority that, if done deliberately, was an insult. There's a story from the reconnaissance of a border castle in Scotland in 1341. A young knight, tired, stripped off his gambeson facing his own straw bed. His back was turned to a senior banneret. The banneret took this as a deliberate slight, a suggestion that the young man considered the elder so weak he didn't need to guard his back. The younger man woke up with a dagger at his throat. He was forced to stand bare-chested in the snow for an hour and then, the next day, fight a duel with his left arm tied behind his back because he had offered no back to guard, so now the back was forfeit. He died of a thrust through the ribs. The rule was that the body's orientation in a shared space was a map of respect, and a misdrawn map meant a border war that ended with a corpse. Even the tying of points, the laces that attached armor plates, was a sacred act. A knight whose armor came loose during battle because a squire had tied a point with a left hand not counterclockwise could, if he survived, charge the squire with sabotage through diabolical influence. The left-hand turn was associated with the sinister, the devil. A statute from the Burgundian army of Charles the Bold in 1473 explicitly said that any armorer or squire who tied a left-hand knot that led to a wound or death of a knight was to have his right hand cut off, then be hanged. But there's a more immediate battlefield rule. If a knight's own garter or knee point came undone and he tripped in the press, causing the death of a comrade, he himself was held responsible for negligent homicide of an ally. The immediate punishment, as recorded after the Battle of Barnet, was for the clumsy knight to be pinned to the ground by his own fallen comrade's sword, driven through the unlaced leg, and left to die. No trial. The rules of war were instant and brutal. Let's talk about the rules of the kiss. A knight's kiss could kill him. The ritual kiss of peace during Mass, the osculum paces, was delivered with a wooden pax board passed row by row. A knight who kissed the pax board before the ranking noble had done so had committed pax theft, stealing the piece from its rightful order. In a documented church incident in the Diocese of Exeter in 1450, a squire passed the board to his knight master too soon. The offended baron, whose lips should have been next, had his men detain the knight outside the church. They forced him to kiss the stone steps of the church until his lips bled. Then his own squire was made to strike him on the mouth with a spoon from the kitchen, bruising his lips closed. He died of an infection that got into the raw lip meat. The coroner recorded it as misadventure of the peace kiss. The rule was that Christ's peace had a noble order, and a knight who jostled the sequence jostled the cosmos, requiring his mouth, the organ of offense, to be destroyed. Then there are the rules about money and gold. A knight was not supposed to handle coin directly in the presence of his equals. Money was dirty, mercantile, lowborn. If a knight drew a purse of coins in the hall to pay a gambling debt, it was considered an act of degradation, showing the merchant's hand. The other knights could seize him and wash his hands in scalding water to purify them of the coin touch. In a case from 15th century Saxony, a knight did this and resisted the scalding, pulling back his hands. The senior knight present declared that the hand that loved gold more than honor must be wedded to gold. They melted a silver groat with a candle and poured the molten metal into his cupped palm. He screamed and lost the hand to burns and then bled to death. The rule was, a knight's palm could hold a sword, a lady's hand, or the Eucharist, but never the greasy coin of the marketplace, on pain of a purifying death. Now let's spend some time on the most elaborate and insane set of rules, the judicial duel or trial by combat. I'm not talking about the general idea. I'm talking about the micro rules that, if broken mid-combat, turn the duel into an execution. The combatants had to enter the lists at precisely the same moment, stepping from their pavilions when the herald dropped his glove. If one knight stepped early, he was stealing time, which was interpreted as sorcery, a belief that he was trying to catch the sun's favor or celestial alignment prematurely. The knights of the guard would seize him. The duel was forfeit, and the early stepper was immediately pronounced guilty of the original charge and sorcery. He was dragged to the gallows inside the lists and hanged without further ado. One story from a combat at Ghent in 1408. A knight accused of treason, desperate to prove his innocence, rushed out a half-second before the signal. His own champion's belt was used as a noose, and his body was left swinging as a warning to the other champion waiting dumbfounded in his tent. The oath-taking before the duel was a lethal incantation. The words had to be recited perfectly. The accused knight would place his right hand on the host or a relic and swear, "So help me God and these holy things that I am guiltless of the deed." If he stammered, if his voice cracked in a way the heralds judged as fear tremor, the oath was declared broken. The man was deemed a perjurer before he even fought. The penalty for oath-breaking in a capital case was that the hand that swore falsely was to be severed and nailed to the courthouse door. The man was then beheaded. In 1456, a knight's voice cracked on the word, "holy." The presiding earl ordered his hand chopped off on the altar rail. The knight, bleeding, was then granted a mercy beheading. The rule was that God spoke through the voice's steadiness, and a tremor was the devil shaking the lie out. During the combat, the rule of the fallen glove played out again. If the accused let go of his weapon and it fell, he could pick it up only if the opponent permitted. The moment the weapon hit the ground, the combat was considered to be in a state of divine suspense. If he lunged for it without a signal, the marshal's men could strike him down with halberds. A Paris combat in 1386 saw a knight, Jean de Courrouges, knock his enemy's sword away. The enemy, Jacques Legris, scrambled for the fallen blade. Courrouges stood over him and shouted, "Hold! Let him not take it." But Legris's hand touched the hilt before any voice of permission. The marshal instantly threw a baton into the list, stopping the fight, and the court declared Legris had attempted to rearm by fraud. He was already on the ground. Courrouges was allowed to kill him with a dagger as he lay. The rule was that the ground owned a fallen weapon until human justice released it, and a premature grasp was theft from God, punishable by losing the right to fight back. The clothing rules for the duel were a theological minefield. A knight could not wear any colored cloth that matched the liturgical color of the season of the duel. If the duel fell during Whitsun, the season of red, and a knight wore red hose or a red plume, it was seen as mocking the Holy Spirit. The marshals would strip the offending color before the fight. If he refused to undress, he forfeited. I found a report of a duel in the Papal States where a knight wore a green silk jupon during ordinary time, which was liturgically green. The bishop halted the proceedings, claiming the knight was arrogating the color of the living church to himself. The knight argued it was just his lady's color. The bishop excommunicated him on the spot, and an excommunicated man could not wage a lawful duel. He was handed over to the secular arm and executed for the original crime, which was murder, despite the duel never occurring. So a color choice based on a lady's favor killed him. The rule of the broken lance was horrifyingly specific. If a lance broke into 3 pieces or more in the first course, it was a sign of the Trinity's favor, and the other knight had to yield or be declared a God-forsaken wretch. But if a lance broke into exactly 2 pieces, that was a sign of dualism, of Manichaean heresy, a bad omen. The knight whose lance broke in 2 could be stopped and interrogated about his orthodoxy. In a tournament in Trier, a knight's lance broke perfectly into 2 equal halves. The lord of the tourney ordered his seizure, and they found a small Cathar prayer book sewn into the lining of his surcoat. He was burned, but here's the key: even if nothing was found, the very omen of the 2-part break was enough to make the knight's own team mistrust him, and he would often be quietly murdered later in the melee, his body trampled as accident. The rule was that geometry of broken would reveal the soul. We must also look at the bizarre rule of the refusal of the leash. A knight could not refuse a direct summons from his liege lord by sending a messenger saying he was ill, unless he could prove the illness by bleeding in front of the herald. The belief was that malingering was a mortal sin of sloth, and a slothful knight was an ox, not a man. The German customs of the 14th century had a ritual. If a knight claimed sickness, the liege's messenger could place a leash, an actual dog leash, around the knight's neck and lead him to the lord's court like a beast. If the knight fought back against the leash, he was a rebel and could be slain on the spot. A chronicle from the town of Soest in 1361 tells of a knight who suffered from a bleeding bowel, yet he refused the leash out of humiliation. He drew a dagger on the herald. His own neighbors, bound by the feudal oath, stormed his chamber and beat him to death with stools, not even swords, because he had become an animal through his refusal. The rule was that a knight's body belonged to his oath before it belonged to his pain, and a painkeeper was a dog to be put down. Now we enter the strange world of church sanctuary and the knight. A knight who sought sanctuary in a church and grasped the altar could not be removed by force unless he released it. But the rules of knighthood overlaid that. If the knight was accused of a shameful crime like treachery, the bishop could grant the secular authorities permission to starve him out. But there was a custom that if the knight could hold onto the altar without food or water for 40 days, he would be considered purged by a divine miracle and set free. If he let go to eat or drink surreptitiously, the marshals waiting outside could cut him down. One night in England in 1298, Sir William de Lisle held onto the altar for 38 days, slipping into madness. His wife snuck him bread soaked in wine. A guard saw her. The knight was condemned as a sanctuary breaker. He was tied to the tail of a horse and dragged around the churchyard until dead. The rule was that the altar hold was a divine wager, and any human aid nullified the miracle, turning the knight into a cheat worthy of vile death. How about the strange, deadly rules of the chess game? Chess was a knightly pastime, but it reflected war. If a knight, while playing, moved a piece in a way that accidentally mirrored a recent tactical blunder in a real campaign, he could be accused of mocking the dead. After the failed siege of a castle in Flanders, a knight in the losing army played chess and recklessly moved his king into a position where it was checkmated in a way that resembled the siege's entrapment. Some brothers-in-arms saw it as a deliberate jest at their fallen friends. They held a court of the green cloth, a gaming court right there. The verdict was that the knight's king folly was an act of posthumous treason against the honor of the dead. They broke his chessboard over his head and then stabbed him with the broken pieces, leaving the white and red painted shards in his body. The rule was that the game was memory, and to play a memory poorly was to desecrate graves. The most chilling rules perhaps are those of the lost seal. A knight's personal seal was his signature and his legal soul. If the seal was lost or stolen, the knight had to declare it publicly with a town crier. If he failed to do so and the seal was used to authenticate a treasonous letter, the knight was held fully accountable because his soul had wandered and committed the crime through the wax. In 1340, a Flemish knight lost his seal matrix in a dice game. It was used by his enemy to forge a letter offering a city gate to the English. When the letter was discovered, the knight's body was quartered, and the quarters were displayed with a wax replica of the seal stuffed into the mouth of the head. The rule was that the seal was not a tool, it was the knight's honor made tangible, and a tangible honor that betrayed could only be answered by dismembering the body that bore it. I could go on for hours. There are the rules of the tent's shadow. You could not let your tent's shadow fall upon another knight's tent of higher rank. You had to physically move it as the sun moved, or you were casting your dark eminence over him, a claim of dominance punished by immediate duel. There's the rule of the torch. The number of torches that escorted a knight to his chamber indicated his standing, and if a squire lit one extra torch, it was an act of lèse-majesté against the superior who was entitled to more light. The squire would lose his hand, and the knight who permitted the extra light could be degraded. There's the rule of the spit in the kitchen. A knight could not pass behind a roasting spit when meat was turning, because the spit's rotation was a symbol of fortune, and crossing behind it reversed a man's luck. and a knight with reversed luck was a peril to the company and could be banished to die in the wilderness. There is the rule of the banner. When a banner was unfurled, it meant war without quarter, no prisoners. A knight who unfurled his banner before the Lord had unfurled his was declaring independent command, usurping the war. That was treason. At the Battle of the Standard in 1138, a knight began to a banner before the bishop's standard was raised. His arm was hacked off by a fellow Anglo-Norman and the banner burned while he watched, before he was beheaded. The rule, the cloth of command, is more sacred than the flesh that raises it. You see, to be a knight was to walk a tightrope of invisible tripwires. Every gesture, every color, every whisper, every piece of food, every scrap of cloth, every accidental touch, every dream, every silence was legislated. Breaking a rule wasn't a social faux pas. It was a fatal removal of the divine order that knights were supposed to embody. The knight was a living sacrament of violence, and a corrupted sacrament must be destroyed. That is the real medieval knight, not a romantic hero, but a man dancing on the edge of a blade, where one misstep meant the blade would dance on his neck. Most terrifying set of rules, the ones that followed a knight into the grave and beyond. Because in the bizarre medieval mind, death didn't release you from the code. Death was simply the final test, the irrevocable audit of every breath you had taken, and a failed audit meant not just the death of the body but the annihilation of memory, the obliteration of the soul's place in the story of the world. I'll walk you through those rules now, and with them, I'll bring this whole bloody tapestry to a close. First, the rule of the dying breath. A knight was expected to face death facing his enemy, even if death came in a sickbed. If a knight died turned toward the wall, his household and chaplain might interpret it as a sign of spiritual cowardice. The body, they believed, was instinctively trying to hide from the divine judgment that approached with the last exhale. There is a harrowing account from a Shropshire manor in 1372. An old knight, Sir Ralph de Wem, lay on his deathbed, racked with fever. In his final moments, he rolled onto his side, his back to the crucifix the priest was holding. The priest declared the death a malignant passing, and the man's son, a newly dubbed knight himself, was required by the local bishop to perform an act of purification. He had to spend the night holding his dead father's body in a seated position, facing the chapel door, while reciting the entire psalter. If he refused, the father would be declared a self-excommunicate and his lands could be seized. The son complied, but in his fatigue he fell asleep and the corpse toppled face down. That fall was deemed a sign of damnation. The bishop imposed an interdict on the family chapel. The son, driven by shame, undertook a penitential crusade to Prussia and never returned, his own knighthood dissolving in the snows. The rule was, the orientation of your final breath was a final testimony, and a false testimony damned your lineage. Now the funeral itself was a lethal stage play of symbols. The knight's body was to be dressed in his arming garments, his surcoat, and his sword was to be laid on his chest with the hilt forming a cross. A gauntlet was placed on the stomach, palm up, to receive the judgment of heaven. If the gauntlet was placed palm down, it symbolized a closed hand, a knight who had refused divine mercy. The herald officiating the funeral could stop the entire ceremony and call for an inquiry into the knight's last deeds. I read a transcript of a funeral halted in Bruges in 1425. The deceased, a knight of the Golden Fleece, had his gauntlet placed wrong by a vengeful squire. The presiding herald seized on this, claimed it reflected a hidden sin, and demanded the body be held until the chapter of the order investigated. The dead knight's brother objected and drew his sword in the church. I've already told you what that means. Sacrilege. The brother was cut down on the spot by the Count of Flanders' guard. The dead knight's burial was delayed 3 years while his estates were litigated. his bones waited in a stone coffin above ground, unburied, which meant his soul was thought to wander as a maimed ghost, a thing peasants feared to pass at night. All because of a gauntlet's angle. And the heraldic funeral was the ultimate accounting. The procession of the dead knight included a riderless horse, the destrier, led behind the coffin. This horse was not just a sentimental gesture. The horse had to be the knight's own best warhorse, and it had to be led by a squire walking backwards, facing the animal, so that the horse's eyes did not look at the coffin. If the horse looked at the coffin, it was said to be reading the death, an omen that the horse would follow the master into the grave within the year. More dangerous for the living, if the horse balked and refused to approach the church door, it signified that the knight's soul was unquiet, that the earth would not receive him. The officiating clergy could then refuse to sing the mass, leaving the knight in a state of spiritual limbo. His family would have to pay for a series of costly private masses to persuade the earth to accept him, often bankrupting the estate. If the funds ran out, the body could be removed from consecrated ground and tossed into a common pit, a fate worse than death in the medieval mind, for it meant the obliteration of individual resurrection. So a stubborn horse could destroy a dynasty. That was the rule of the equine oracle. Then there was the execution of the effigy. If a knight died under a cloud of accusation, treason, heresy, unreconciled excommunication, and the body was somehow already buried or unreachable, the authorities could hold a funeral of derision using a life-sized effigy made of wood and wax. This effigy would be dressed in the knight's actual armor, which would be stripped from the corpse's tomb if necessary. The effigy would be tried in a church court, with a prosecutor reading charges against it. A defender, if any could be found, would argue for the effigy. If condemned, the effigy was subjected to a formal degradation, just like a living knight. The spurs were hacked off its heels, the sword broken over its head, and its shield turned upside down. Then the effigy was dragged through the streets by horses to the gallows, hanged, and finally burned. The most chilling part? This ceremony was believed to affect the actual soul of the deceased, dragging it out of purgatory and down to hell. And any living descendants who protested were complicit in the original crime. In 1314, after the execution of the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay, many dead Templar knights were posthumously tried as effigies across France. Their tombs were smashed open, their stone likenesses decapitated, and the carved guisants were put on mock trial. The rule was that the effigy was an extension of the body, and justice deferred was justice delivered through wax and wood, the verdict echoing into eternity. Now I want to tell you about the final, most intimate rule of them all, the rule of the last sword. Upon a knight's death, his personal sword could not simply be passed to his son without a ritual of sword reconciliation. The belief was that the sword had absorbed the knight's sins, his angers, his broken oaths. If the son took up the father's sword without the blade being ritually cleansed, the son inherited the sins. The cleansing involved laying the sword on an altar for a full night, then a priest blessing it with salt, water, and wine. If the son refused the ritual, taking up the blade in haste because of a sudden siege or raid, and then lost a battle or committed a crime, the demonic inheritance was proven true. The son was considered blade-possessed, and the only cure was to kill him with the very sword, which was then melted down. A case from the Scottish Marches in 1398 saw a young knight take his slain father's sword directly from his cooling hand to defend the tower against reivers. He killed a man in that fight, but later, in a drunken rage, he killed a clansman. His mother, wrapped in the old beliefs, screamed that he had drawn his father's wrath into his arm. The clan elders, a mix of pagan and Christian custom, disarmed him, broke the sword over a stone, and then drove the longest shard through his heart. They buried him face down at a crossroads with the broken blade pieces under his back. The rule was that a sword's history lived in the steel, and a tainted history could only be ended by turning the steel against the last living bearer. Let's spiral outward to the rules that govern the end of a knightly order itself. When an order was suppressed, like the Templars, the knights faced a unique death penalty built on their own rules. The Templar rule required absolute obedience, chastity, poverty. The charge of heresy broke all three. But the execution method for the high-ranking ones, like burning at the stake, was chosen specifically to mirror their own rule against uncleanness. Fire purifies. The fire destroyed the flesh that had allegedly spat on the cross. But here's the lesser-known rule from the Templar trials. Any knight who confessed and then recanted his confession was a relapsed heretic and must be burned without a hearing. This was the rule that killed dozens. It was not just secular law. It was a borrowed knightly custom that a knight's word, once given, was iron. To recant was to prove the word was straw, and a straw man had no right to live. The Templars who died screaming at the stake in Paris in 1310 were dying because they obeyed the knightly rule of confession and then, in an agony of conscience, broke it by taking back their forced admissions. Their own code strangled them. And then there was the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War in France, where the rules of knightly vengeance took on a genocidal logic. The rule of the blood debt tally meant that if your lord was killed by a certain faction, you were not a true knight until you had killed a specific number of that faction's knights, often 3 for 1. This was codified in some retinue contracts. If a knight failed to meet his blood debt tally within a year, his own comrades would convene a court of debt and sentence him to death as a debt defaulter. In 1418, after the massacres in Paris, a Burgundian knight was found to have not killed any Armagnac knights in revenge for his slaughtered brother. His fellow knights bound him with the chains of his brother's tomb and lowered him into the river Seine. The rule was that grief was a military obligation, and a heart that didn't shed enemy blood was a bankrupt heart, unworthy to beat. Let's talk about the rules of age. A knight was never supposed to die in bed. A peaceful death in old age, while common in reality, was ideologically a failure. The chivalric romance stated a knight should die in battle, his blood soaking the earth. If a knight lingered into feeble old age, he was expected to become a hermit or a monk, exchanging the sword for the psalter. If he remained in the hall, toothless and shaking, trying to command, he risked a ritual called the sending. His family would stage a feast, and at the end, the oldest son would present him with a shroud and a blunt sword, symbolically notifying him that his time as a knight was over. If the old man refused the shroud, clutching his sharp sword and demanding obedience, the household faced a crisis. A chronicle from Aragon in 1276 tells of a senile knight, Don Pedro de Urbi, who refused to yield command of the castle. His own sons, following the advice of the bishop, overpowered him, wrapped him in the shroud while he cursed them, and carried him to a remote hermitage. He was walled up in a comfortable cell, a living tomb, with a small window for food. He lived 6 more months, screaming at anyone who passed. The sons were absolved of parricide because the sending ritual legally declared the old man already dead. The rule was that a knight who overstayed his biological war was an undead creature, and the undead must be walled away before they consumed the living. The rule of the broken vow of pilgrimage was a final, merciless clause. Many knights took a crusader's vow or a vow to visit a distant shrine, like Santiago de Compostela or Jerusalem. If they died before fulfilling it, the vow was a debt on the estate. The heir had to go, or pay a large commutation to the church. If the heir refused both, the dead knight's body could be exhumed and placed outside the church door, blocking the entrance, until the debt was paid. This was called the obstacle of the faithless bones. In a notorious case in the Diocese of Autun in 1336, the heirs of a Burgundian knight refused to pay for a proxy pilgrimage. The bishop ordered the coffin dug up and placed on the threshold of the parish church, forcing the congregation to step over it. The stench of the decaying body, even in its lead shell, eventually sickened the priest. The village shunned the family. The eldest son, ostracized, was ambushed by a rival and killed. The debt died with him, and the old knight's bones were finally reinterred, but the family was ruined. The rule was that a sacred vow outlived the soul, and a bone debtor was a curse upon the ground he had stolen. Now the final, most peculiar rule I will leave you with, the rule of the final breath court. In some highly ritualized orders, when a knight died, the surviving brothers would gather in the chapter house and hold a formal trial of the dead man's soul. A white cloth would be laid on the floor, representing the deceased's purity, and a black cloth beside it, representing his sins. Each brother would stand and recount a memory of the dead knight, placing a white stone on the white cloth for a virtuous act, a black stone on the black cloth for a failure. If the black stones outnumbered the white, the dead brother was pronounced a black soul, and his name was stricken from the order's necrology. His arms were erased from the roll, his tomb effigy was defaced, and his family lost all privileges of the order. Even worse, the order would send a formal declaration to the Pope, asking for the knight's soul to be condemned, a letter called the Devil's Missive. One such missive from the Teutonic Knights to the Papal Curia in 1405 survives, concerning a dead knight who had secretly embezzled order funds. The letter describes a trial in which 93 black stones were laid against 7 white ones. The dead man was posthumously expelled from the order and declared a thief. His family castle was raided by the order's marshal, and his son was stripped of knighthood. The rule was that a knight's life was subject to a continuous audit, and the final balance was struck after death, the judgment of his peers reaching into the grave to cancel his existence utterly. This was the world of the medieval knight. Not the golden tapestry we like to remember, but a web of merciless customs, each thread a tripwire for the neck, the soul, and the memory. Every act was a ritual. Every ritual was a potential death sentence. The knight was a slave to his own image, a prisoner of a code that existed to consume him the moment he deviated. And in the end, even the grave offered no escape, because the rules followed him down into the dark, presided over by the living who would judge his bones, break his sword, and scratch his name from the Book of Honor. That was the price of bearing arms. That was the death they agreed to. That was knighthood.